Tonight, the Prime Minister under fire as the SNC-Lavalin controversy makes a dramatic return.
I take responsibility for the mistakes that I made.
A damning ethics report says Justin Trudeau broke the law. What does it mean for him, for Jody Wilson-Raybould, and for the election just 10 weeks away? We have extensive coverage, including at issue.
North American markets plunge, the biggest drop of the year. Why it's fueled by fear of a recession.
There's so much love for her in the world, and so many people support what she's doing.
And Bon Voyage, a teenage activist sets sail for a climate change summit in New York. How Greta Thunberg is taking a stand and inspiring a generation. This is The National. Justin Trudeau came to power 4 years ago, promising a new era of ethics and transparency. And now, just weeks before the next election is set to begin, he's been found to have violated the country's conflict of interest laws again, this time in the SNC-Lavalin affair. At the center of it was an attorney general who claimed she had been improperly pressured to help the Quebec engineering giant avoid criminal prosecution. And then you had a prime minister saying that was simply not the case and that he did nothing wrong. Well, today, the ethics commissioner disagreed. The scathing report describes how Trudeau engaged in a flagrant attempt to influence Jody Wilson-Raybould to further SNC-Lavalin's private interests, and declared that Trudeau and his office used their authority to circumvent, undermine, and ultimately attempt to discredit Wilson-Raybould's authority as Attorney General. Now, there's no penalty or even fine for breaking these rules. The price is political, and the cost has added up for the governing Liberals. Katie Simpson explains how this ruling marks another stunning blow, now less than 10 weeks before voters go to the polls.
Facing a damning assessment of his actions, the Prime Minister today acknowledged mistakes were made. What happened will never happen again on his watch, Justin Trudeau says, but don't for a moment think he's sorry.
What we did over the past year wasn't good enough. But at the same time, I can't apologize for standing up for Canadian jobs.
In his report, Ethics Commissioner Mario Dion found the Prime Minister directly and through his senior officials used various means to exert influence over Ms. Wilson-Raybould. There were many ways Trudeau went about trying to bend the will of the former Attorney General, directing his staff to find a solution that would safeguard SNC-Lavalin's business interests.
The buck stops with the Prime Minister, and I assume responsibility for everything that happened in my office.
While he is now publicly accepting responsibility, he told Dion something else. Mr. Trudeau argued that he could not be held vicariously liable for the actions of his senior advisors and other senior departmental officials. Dion didn't buy it. The evidence abundantly shows that Mr. Trudeau knowingly sought to influence Ms. Wilson-Raybould both directly and through the actions of his agents.
I experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere.
The independent investigation lines up with the version of events presented by the former Attorney General, who describes the report as a vindication of sorts.
I certainly believe that there is enough evidence here to warrant an RCMP investigation.
Amid renewed calls for police to step in, the RCMP said it is examining this matter carefully and will take appropriate actions as required.
And what we have now is a clear picture of who Justin Trudeau truly is, and it's not who he promised he would be.
Trudeau's opponents were quick to point out this is his second ethics violation. A family vacation in 2016 to the Aga Khan's private island broke the rules since the spiritual leader had lobbied the government.
Mr. Trudeau cannot be the Prime Minister of Canada, and I'm hoping people in the election coming up make that decision.
And Katie Simpson is in the foyer of the House of Commons, so let's hear more about the person at the center of this scandal. What more did Jody Wilson-Raybould have to say?
She says she's grateful for the report, adding she's glad the commissioner wasn't distracted by wrong information about the events or about her personally. She's now going to point to this as evidence that she wants to do politics differently.
Yeah, and she is running as an independent in Vancouver. But for the Liberals, you know, and I'm thinking ahead here, are there consequences for the Trudeau advisors who will be working on his election campaign?
No one's been thrown under the bus just yet. Justin Trudeau is standing by his inner circle. No one's been fired. No one's been kicked off his re-election campaign team. But Justin Trudeau said this is going to be part of a bigger question for Canadians when they vote this fall.
Okay, Katie Simpson on Parliament Hill tonight. Thanks very much. And just hours after the Ethics Commissioner dropped his report, the Prime Minister released a report he commissioned on whether the dual role of Minister of Justice and Attorney General should change. They are two jobs, each with much different duties. Minister of Justice is a political role, responsible for developing policy, drafting legislation. Attorney General, meanwhile, gives nonpartisan legal advice to Cabinet and represents the government in court. So it raises the question, with two different roles, is it time to have two different people perform them? Well, today, the report concluded no, and that splitting them doesn't benefit the justice system. Now, Justin Trudeau did cover a lot of ground today when he stepped in front of the microphone, saying he took responsibility for his mistakes, but also he defended what he did. Vashi Kappelos, host of Power and Politics, of course, also in Ottawa. So, Vashi, how do we make sense of Trudeau's, at times, contradictory statements?
Hey, Andrew, well, we don't have to look far. Take a listen to the Prime Minister's first answer in response to a reporter's question earlier today on this issue.
First off, I want to thank the Ethics Commissioner for his report. And even though I disagree with some of his conclusions, I fully accept this report and take responsibility for everything that happened.
The first thing that would pique our interest here is how do you accept responsibility and accept the report, but then also say you disagree with part of it? And the part that the Prime Minister disagrees with is a big one. It's kind of underpins the whole conclusion that the Ethics Commissioner reached, which is that the Prime Minister should never have talked to the Attorney General about this case at all. So the Prime Minister on one hand is saying, I don't agree with that part, but hey, I accept the report. And the two don't really jive. Right.
And so that's one thing. I mean, but even beyond that, everyone's wondering what happens now if this has an impact. The Prime Minister addressed that too.
There are many lessons to be learned on this, and that's why we will be moving forward with the recommendations on how to both advocate for the public interest and defend the integrity and the independence of our judicial and prosecutorial processes.
And here the Prime Minister is doing something he's done a few times over the past few months. He's saying this is about the role of the Justice Minister and the role of the Attorney General and how they were confused. And it just wasn't clear what he and other members of his office could say to the Attorney General. But that is not the conclusion the Ethics Commissioner reached. He said underpinning it all, again, is the fact that Justin Trudeau and those members of his office acted unethically in their pursuit of whatever they say was their motivation, and in pursuit of whatever they're claiming they were doing it about, whether it to be save jobs or anything along those lines. The way in which they did it, the Ethics Commissioner ruled, was unethical. They broke the rules. Andrew?
Vashi Kappelos, thanks very much. Now, the most important consequence will certainly be how Canadians react, and that's true for Jody Wilson-Raybould as well. At the height of the SNC-Lavalin affair, she quit the Liberal cabinet before being kicked out of caucus. And as I mentioned, in the fall, she will be running as an independent candidate. So we went to her riding of Vancouver-Granville to see how people are taking today's news.
I have my questions about how this story was dealt with and how it's been dragged out over months and months and months.
I always believed her. I love her. I will vote for her, for sure. She just seemed genuine and believable, and the story she was telling had a ring of truth to it, for sure.
She used to be in my riding. I've never voted for her, and she's not getting my vote.
She's a fighter, and I think a lot of people will vote for her, especially around this area. I really like her. I wish she would have won for Prime Minister. She would be good.
I think when you pretend that you're for everybody and you're shown that you're just as bad as everybody else, that it comes back and haunt you. And he's been trying to be virtuous, and he's obviously not virtuous, and the only virtuous person in the whole thing was Jody.
Now, I think you'll agree a day like today just begs for ad issue. So summer break aside, we've assembled the panel. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Chris Hall will join me with their takes on all of this in about 10 minutes. And Ian, we're also watching Hong Kong tonight.
As you know, Andrew, it's been volatile there, and Canadians are being urged by Ottawa to use caution. After 10 weeks, no end in sight to the increasingly violent clashes between pro-democracy protesters and police. Chaos paralyzed Hong Kong's busy international airport for 2 days until a court order today forced demonstrators out. But as Tanya Fletcher reports, the tension didn't end there.
The violence between protesters and police hasn't stopped, but it has moved elsewhere. The clashes turned from the airport back to the streets. This group of demonstrators descending on a police station to denounce police brutality, some aiming laser pointers at the building. Their actions met with tear gas from riot police. The looming concern is how Beijing will respond. New satellite images appear to show a significant Chinese military buildup along Hong Kong's border. Other footage shows more paramilitary personnel stationed in the neighboring city of Shenzhen. The unrest is stirring up unease around the world. Nearly 24 countries now posting travel advisories, including Canada.
Currently, our advice is to exercise a high degree of caution.
The Foreign Affairs Minister is now publicly warning Canadians, not just travelers, but also the 300,000 living in Hong Kong. She chose her words very carefully when asked about China describing the protests as near-terrorist acts, words interpreted by many as a threat.
I think that it is very important everywhere in the world for governments to listen carefully to their people.
Others, not so subtle.
I think China has overreacted.
Emily Lau is a pro-democracy leader with a strong message.
We are calling on Beijing not to do anything foolish, like moving more troops across the boundary into Hong Kong. This is not Tiananmen Square.
Other answers will come from the demonstrators themselves, their message laced with determination.
But we still continue with our courage and urge government must listen to our voice.
Joshua Wong is one of the original protest leaders.
And I hope people around the world still keep Hong Kong under the global spotlight.
He says they're planning another demonstration for Sunday and expecting 500,000 people. Tanya Fletcher, CBC News, Vancouver.
And one more note on this, as the U.S. and China try to work out a trade deal. Today, Donald Trump pointedly tied its success to how China handles the Hong Kong situation, tweeting out, of course, China wants to make a deal. Let them work humanely with Hong Kong first. The 16-year-old climate change activist who inspired student protests around the world has begun a zero-emission journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Instead of flying to a United Nations Climate Summit next month in New York, Greta Thunberg set sail today from England. And the CBC's Susan Ormiston was there.
For many, Greta Thunberg is a beacon of hope for the climate.
Safe journey! Bye!
The Swedish teenager is going to America, but she has to get there first without flying. Air travel is too carbon dirty for her.
I am not telling anyone what to do or what not to do. I am one of the very, very few people in the world who actually can do this, and then I think I should take that chance to do this.
Her chance is to cross the Atlantic on a high-tech racing yacht, the Militia 2, powered by wind and solar and underwater turbines for electricity. It's not comfortable. The toilet's a bucket, her bed a fold-down bunk for 2 weeks at least on the open sea. A challenge.
Maybe, I don't know, seasickness.
Thunberg started as a solitary protester outside Parliament in Stockholm, worried about what she calls a climate emergency. She rocketed out of Sweden, attracting millions of followers, now in the running for a Nobel Peace Prize.
I just want her to know that there's so much love for her in the world and so many people support what she's doing, because there's a lot of trolls, there's a lot of negativity about what this young woman has achieved.
Just a year ago, no one had heard of Greta Thunberg, but with her fearless and frank way of speaking, she has struck a nerve, particularly with young people who believe they're inheriting a polluted planet. But her age and her meteoric rise as a climate activist has made her a target. Ignorant, maniacal, mercilessly manipulated, an American lobbyist. So young, so many mental disorders, but treated as a guru, an Australian columnist. She bats off her critics.
There are always going to be people who don't understand or don't accept the United Science. And I mean, I will just ignore them.
Her mission, she says, is simple: to make people care, and if that spreads, there will be more action. An idealist, maybe, but one with a powerful global platform. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Plymouth, England.
We're live and tracking a breaking story out of Philadelphia tonight. At least 6 police officers have been shot in what officials say is still an active and ongoing standoff.
I'm trying to let him know that he can end this peacefully now. We've called him multiple times. He has picked up the phone a couple times, but he has not answered.
The 6 officers do not have life-threatening injuries. All of them have been released from area hospitals. The standoff began after police tried to serve a narcotics warrant at a home. There was an exchange of gunfire, and some officers were able to escape through windows and doors. 2 others were trapped inside with the shooter, but we've just learned a SWAT team managed to get them out safely. Police say the shooter remains inside and remains armed.
You see him clearly here. He's holding a towel over his hand. And she's walking out barefoot. They're arguing.
And Peel Regional Police are looking for this man, 31-year-old Michael Cleghorn, accused of shooting the woman in the surveillance video. When police confronted him, he stole a cruiser. Officers tried to tase him, even fired on the car, but he got away. He ditched the cruiser a short distance away and stole an SUV. Cleghorn is also wanted on murder charges in Thunder Bay and sex assault charges in Toronto.
We have to figure out how to reduce the gun violence, but at the same time, not turn neighborhoods and communities upside down.
Police in Toronto have unveiled a new plan for tackling gun violence in the city. There have been nearly 270 shootings so far this year, with more than 400 victims. The new initiative is called Project Community Space. It rolls out tomorrow and will last 11 weeks. Among other things, it will bolster the city's guns and gangs unit and make officers more visible in areas associated with gun violence. A 31-year-old from London, England is facing 3 criminal charges, allegedly assaulting and threatening a flight attendant on a plane from Europe bound for Chicago. But instead, the pilot landed here in Happy Valley Goose Bay after crew members restrained Edward Myhill. The RCMP arrested him, and he will stay in custody at least until next week.
Okay, another story we're watching tonight, global stock markets in turmoil. The sell-off began this morning in the U.S., sparked by fears over a global economic slowdown. Now, there are a lot of different factors contributing to this. Perhaps most ominous, though, the bond market. So Peter Armstrong here to take us through it. Not a simple topic by any stretch. No. Okay, but what are the bond markets telling us?
Well, it's funny that every now and again, the bond market kind of rears its head and reminds us that it's way bigger and way more important than the stock market. It's nearly twice as big as stock markets. And it tells us all kinds of really important data about economic growth all over the world. And today, it told us it's worried. It's worried about global trade wars. It's worried about global growth slowing. And when the bond market says this is something to be worried about, it's something everybody has to sit up and take notice.
Right, and what people are noticing is this yield curve inversion, right? So the bond market doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do?
Right. I mean, the yield curve, it sounds very jargony and very complicated. It's not. If you loan on the short term, 2 years, say, that usually would yield you less reward than a longer loan of, say, 10 years. That's it. That's the so-called yield curve. And this morning, it flipped. The 2-year U.S. Treasury bill had a higher yield than the 10-year Treasury bill.
Right, except the last time this happened, I mean, it was over 10 years ago, right? But what followed was a financial crisis.
Almost immediately. And in fact, the last 7 recessions have been precipitated by some kind of inversion at some point in that yield curve.
And so today's inversion, I mean, it was relatively short-lived. The stock markets, it was cold comfort for them, though.
It was. It only actually inverted for a couple of hours, but the stock market said to pay attention, and the bond market said to pay attention, and the stock market certainly caught up and take notice, as they should. I mean, let's take a look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Right at the opening, the Dow plunged. It closed the day down nearly 3%, 800 points. And this really just adds to what's been an incredibly ugly few weeks for the Dow. It's down nearly 2,000 points just in the last 3 weeks.
Peter Armstrong, thank you, sir.
You bet.
And still ahead on The National, what will the Ethics Commissioner's report mean for the upcoming election? We've called in an emergency at issue to answer that very question and more.
And later in our moment, ever heard of squid jigging? We'll tell you all about the Newfoundland tradition that is making a comeback.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up not far from here in Harbour, Maine, so I used to see this regularly in the 1970s. It used to be a routine, and now it's a phenomenon.
There is one issue from Justin Trudeau's first mandate that's perhaps done more damage than any other, the SNC-Lavalin controversy.
I take full responsibility. The buck stops with the Prime Minister.
It's shaken the very foundation of the Liberal government and called into question the judgment.
Justin Trudeau bullied, attempted to interfere, and then denied so blatantly.
The ethics and the integrity.
How do we know that he's not going to do this again? How can he be trusted?
Of a Prime Minister who's pledged 4 years ago he would do things differently. And there's already been a price to pay. 2 high-profile ministers lost their jobs. So did the Prime Minister's close friend and principal secretary. And this single event perhaps caused the most harm in public opinion polls.
We are facing a moment in a couple of months where Canadians get to make a choice about the kind of government that they want to see lead them.
So, with today's Ethics Commissioner's report, the question now, will all of this cost the Liberal government dearly come October? So let's get into it. Rosie is away, but we have called in a special summer edition of At Issue. And yes, I know it's not Thursday, but close enough. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne in Toronto, and Chris Hall is in Ottawa tonight. Chantal, let's start with you. And just on the question of how damaging this all may be, I mean, to what extent does this hurt the Liberals come election time?
Well, come election time, I can't answer the question, but it is a damning report and one that singles out the Prime Minister for blame to the exclusion of others. Most of us, I think, didn't think it was possible to make Justin Trudeau's handling of this file look worse than Jody Wilson-Raybould had when she testified in front of a parliamentary committee. But the Ethics Commissioner managed to do just that. There are no great lines to salvage the Prime Minister's behavior in that report. So that is where the damage is. The saving graces, if there are some, I would say, is the earliest the better. So better this report today than in 2 weeks or in a month when the campaign is in full swing. It's easier to try to figure out how to control damage. And the other question is, if Canadians base their vote on this report, Justin Trudeau is in huge trouble. But I'm not convinced that that is what they will base their vote on, and that remains to be seen.
Right, and you raise an important issue, the very fact being that we are still 2 months plus away from E-Day. Andrew, I want to hear from you, but first let's hear from the Prime Minister himself. So in his own words, in his own defense.
This was a situation that shouldn't have happened. But my desire to protect Canadians and at the same time to protect the integrity and the independence of our judicial institutions remained throughout.
So Andrew, he's trying to walk a line there, right? On the one hand, he's saying, look, I take responsibility, but then he's also saying, understand that all I really cared about at the end of the day, jobs. How effective is that position going to be?
Not terribly, I don't think, except to the hardcore partisan base, which may matter at this point.
It's clear he doesn't really think he did anything particularly wrong, maybe, you know, looked improper or what have you, but still thinks his motives were good. In the Ethics Commissioner's report, he says that Trudeau's lawyers said he can't be held to account for any of this. It was all just people acting on his behalf, and he's not really directly responsible. So yeah, I think it matters both because it's reviving the story, which did them enormous damage in the spring. You have a respected public servant with access to all the best legal advice and most of the evidence in this case, some of it still withheld from him, but more evidence than we've had to date, basically making a formal finding that Jody Wilson-Raybould was correct in all the major particulars on this. And you have some fairly damning details. I mean, whether or not this was a conflict of interest is frankly the least of my concerns. There is evidence here of how most of the government seemed to be taking its lead from SNC-Lavalin's lawyers, was working hand in glove with them, basically conspiring against their own attorney general to get them off of criminal charges. That cries out for further explanation. I mean, these wild schemes to involve the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Beverly McLaughlin, who appears to have declined, but I'd like to hear more from her about how far she entertained these frankly crazy notions. I think would be there's much more still to be learned about this.
Right, except, you know, I was trying to really listen to what Justin Trudeau was saying, but maybe more importantly, trying to listen to what he may have been telegraphing to Canadians. And I wondered if there was a strategic opportunity for him here in the sense that he was saying, look, this is proof of how much I care about jobs, that even when I don't think other people outside of my inner circle are watching, this is what I do, and look how much trouble I've gotten into because I care so much about jobs. Is there an opportunity there, Chris, do you think?
I would think that there would be a better opportunity if the Prime Minister's version of events hadn't changed so dramatically since February when this first came out. Remember, he said the story originally from the Globe and Mail was false. Then he said that no one had directed Jody Wilson-Raybould to do anything, which was never the allegation in the first place. And then he said she probably didn't take it the same way we had intended. So if the message today is that he accepts the report, then why does he disagree with most of the findings about his culpability in this and the fact that he needs to take responsibility? And in the end, if he's going to go to Canadians with a message that I care so much about jobs, there's a lot of evidence that's come out since that first argument that there weren't so many jobs at stake, that so many infrastructure projects are on the books here, that the people who work for SNC-Lavalin would have found work with other contractors anyway. So it's a difficult argument, I think, to make given how inconsistent he's been on this over the past few months.
Chantal, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
I think that's the larger issue. You know, people will say, are people going to base their votes on this particular issue? Maybe some will, maybe a lot won't. I think the more damage that's done in the long term from these kinds of things is the damage to the perception of the Prime Minister. And even after people have forgotten the particulars of a particular issue, they will remember that he looked dodgy, he didn't seem trustworthy. You know, these kinds of impressions have much more, I think, long-lasting and damaging effects on a party and on a leader.
Chantal?
True enough. The fact is, though, that there is a lot of public fatigue with this issue. It's gone on for a long time. There were not I found the report really troubling, and the connection between SNC-Lavalin and the government basically operating as one troubling. But I'm not sure that that amounts to a huge revelation to many voters. And I suspect that most voters at this point had already made up their minds as to whether they felt Trudeau had really stepped into it over SNC-Lavalin or whether he'd just been trying to get to his job. So I'm curious to see in 2-3 weeks when the storm is blown over, where public opinion stands on this and whether it goes back to where it was yesterday.
Okay, so then let's try to get inside the minds of Jagmeet Singh and Andrew Scheer. You know, on the capacity for the opposition to run with the ball, federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh framed Trudeau as working for Canada's wealthiest, not the everyman. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer said this.
Today's verdict is in, and it is a guilty verdict. Justin Trudeau is guilty again. Heading into this election, Trudeau has already become the only Prime Minister in Canadian history to have been found guilty of breaking ethics laws. Now, we know he's done it again.
Okay, Andrew, so we hear this word guilty, and clearly, I mean, the Ethics Commissioner's findings aren't taking place in a court of law, so it's not a guilty verdict as such that we're talking about, but Scheer is framing it that way, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that's necessarily his best play on this. I mean, the knock against Scheer is he's not doesn't have particularly a great deal of gravitas, that he tends to exploit the short-term opportunities at the expense of the long-term vision of the country and everything else. I would, rather than him going for the cheap applause line to try to explain to Canadians why this matters, why prosecutorial independence is a serious thing, why messing around with the prosecution of a Liberal-connected company that is accused of pretty serious crimes should not be tolerated. Why these things are important principles, I think, would be not only in the interest of public education, would look a little more statesmanlike on his behalf than just the kind of, as I say, the cheap applause line.
Yeah, could I jump in there too? I was struck today by what should be an obvious warning signal for every political leader, that trust is not in great abundance right now. And if you're now saying that the guy who promised to be different 4 years ago really isn't any different, but you're going to be different if the Conservatives are elected, it's not a message I think most Canadians want to hear.
Right, and it was interesting because it took Andrew Scheer all of 2 minutes to pivot from trying to skewer Trudeau into saying, well, here, you know, the more pragmatic approach perhaps is the fact that, hey, I'm running too. I'm going to be in the election and I'm your guy. Chantal, you're kind of shaking your head, though.
Well, I thought both opposition leaders did not rise up to the occasion and could have done a lot more. And on this, I agree with Andrew that Andrew Scheer's point involved a lot of rehashing of conservative lines over the past few months. And this was a grave occasion. Too bad for him that he squandered the Prime Minister should resign line too early, because reading this report, it does come to mind more than it did when he first asked for the resignation of the Prime Minister. As for Mr. Singh, he must have decided that he has no hopes in Quebec if he is going to go with the line that SNC-Lavalin is only about rich people. Because in this province, that line will never work. People know who the people are who work for SNC-Lavalin, and they're not rich people who are friends of Justin Trudeau. So both sounded like they were reading their prepared lines. I understand that no one expected the report today, but if that is how they're all going to run campaigns, good luck, because the unexpected and how you handle it is usually when voters discover whether you have what it takes to get their vote.
Right, and so I mean, 2 months, you know, until election time, that is a long time. So what is your sense then? Because I was going to ask what the Liberals would have to do to avoid this becoming a bigger problem than it already is. But I feel like the collective sense that I'm getting from all of you is that, well, maybe the problem sort of takes care of itself.
Well, I'm not saying that. Yeah, I'm not saying that. I think that the Liberals will obviously try to turn attention to other issues, healthcare, climate change, where they're obviously on firmer footing. But this whole thing about trust and the fact that Justin Trudeau was really 4 years ago the banner around which the Liberals rose from the ashes of being the third party in the House of Commons to being government. If that's been eroded in any significant way, as Andrew indicated earlier, that will be a very difficult sell everywhere in the country, I would argue, including Quebec.
I mean, this is a government, I mean, all governments heavily focus on their leader, on the Prime Minister. This is a government that more than most, certainly in the first 2 or 3 years of its mandate, it was almost obsessively devoted to, you know, putting the Prime Minister front and center in every photo op, et cetera. He is really damaged goods now, and this report is going to continue that. But I'll come back to something Chris was saying. If Andrew Scheer wants to take advantage of that, he has to convince people that he'd be something different. And something different is not just shouting guilty. Something different is displaying the maturity and the judgment and the wisdom and the integrity that you would act in a different way given the same set of circumstances. And that he's far from making that case.
And to build on that point, if this were a referendum on Justin Trudeau, not great. But this is a choice that people have to make, and the other options on offer have to look like they're significantly better, and not just on saying, well, I wouldn't do as badly as he did with SNC-Lavalin, but in the larger picture. And I would argue that today, no one actually won the day. It was a lost day, I think, for trust and for Canadians.
Okay, well, this was day one. Plenty more boxing to come, I suppose. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Chris Hall, thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew.
But before we go, be sure to subscribe to the At Issue podcast. You can look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, or on cbcnews.ca/The National. And hey, Rosemary and At Issue will be back the first week of September.
Still ahead on The National, coping at university. We look at a new resource giving students the tools to manage their mental health when it all seems too much.
When you are overwhelmed, when you are in crisis, that you will be able to know what to do and know how to manage for yourself.
Welcome back. At least 6 people have been killed after 2 homes collapsed in Chile. Debris was still falling hours after the initial collapse, forcing rescue workers to pause the search for the 4 people still missing. Local media report that as many as 15 people were standing on a staircase that connected the 2 properties in the moments prior to the collapse, but there is no word yet on what caused it.
We're disappointed. And of course, when you read the verdict, you get the impression that we were so close to getting a super good result.
American rapper A$AP Rocky has been convicted of assault in Sweden, stemming from a street brawl on June 30th in Stockholm. He and 2 members of his entourage beat a 19-year-old after an argument. None of them were sentenced to jail, but they will have to pay compensation to the victim. And that conviction may have an impact on Western University in London, Ontario. A$AP Rocky scheduled to headline this year's Purple Fest in September. The event was created by the Student Council in 2016 to try to counter an unsanctioned street party. The council wasn't saying anything today other than it's not prepared to announce what it's doing this fall. So it's still mid-August, but many students are already thinking about the fall, especially those about to start university. For some students, it can be a challenging, lonely time. And so now, some mental health advocates are launching a new resource they hope will help prevent burnout, breakdowns, and ultimately suicide. It's available online today. Karen Paul's now on making back to school better.
Kaur is getting ready to move from Winnipeg to the University of Victoria.
I'm 70% prepared, like mentally.
Prepared, but also nervous about living on her own for the first time.
I'm taking care of my own keys and locking my door and making sure I'm not losing any important documents.
And dealing with the academic workload.
I end up taking a lot on my plate and then I panic and get overwhelmed.
She's not alone. For years, students have been demanding more mental health resources on campus. Statistics show between 2 and 10% of students think about killing themselves. Every year, some follow through.
This is about prevention.
So this mental health expert has created a new resource aimed specifically at building resilience for first-year students.
So that when you are stressed, when you are overwhelmed, when you are in crisis, that you will be able to know what to do and know how to manage for yourself.
They were struggling.
Sam Fiorella knows how important that is. His son Lucas killed himself while studying computer science at Carleton University in 2014.
On top of the shock of losing a child, it was the shock of not even knowing that it was potentially coming.
Fiorella says this new handbook is a great start, but he says the format is a little old-fashioned.
This should be a mobile app that could actually engage with them, like with a reminder, hey, it's a good time to check in before exams.
Back in Winnipeg, Kaur likes to be prepared.
I've pinned some lists down on Pinterest.
She hopes to get a hold of the handbook before university even starts.
I think it's very important to actually know what you could be nervous about, because kind of getting surprised by it in the moment is not okay, because then you can't deal with it. Come here. Hi.
If this new resource can help students like Kaur deal with their stress better, researchers say they'll give it a passing grade. Karen Pauls, CBC News, Toronto.
And just ahead on The National, the danger that may lurk in deer. Some doctors and activists warn that more needs to be done to make sure a frightful disease doesn't get into your food supply.
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has to create a new policy immediately.
White-tailed deer are found all over Canada, from southern BC to Cape Breton Island, but in some exceptionally rare cases, they could actually pose a serious health risk. Now, they can be carriers of what some have nicknamed zombie deer disease. And recently, more than 30 doctors, researchers, and activists called on the federal government to make sure it doesn't spread into the human food system. Alison Northcott explains why.
At this Montreal butcher, Quebec venison is on offer, and staff here are more than confident it's safe.
We always get this deer meat from always the same supplier, and that supplier never really had any problem.
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency says animals like deer and elk slaughtered in abattoirs in Quebec, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, and Yukon must be tested for chronic wasting disease, or CWD, before the meat can be sold for food. The disease affects the central nervous system in hooved animals like deer and is similar to mad cow disease. While the CFIA says there is no direct scientific evidence it can be transmitted to humans, it recommends people don't eat infected meat and says there is a range of precautions to keep it out of the food system. But 3 new cases detected on Alberta farms this year have some calling on the government to do more.
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is under the jurisdiction of our federal health minister and Health Canada, has to create a new policy immediately that ensures that no meat from contaminated CWD farms, deer or elk in Canada, is permitted to go into the human food chain.
Part of her concern is around what happened last year when the disease was confirmed at a deer farm in Quebec. The herd was culled along with wild deer in the surrounding area. But CFIA has said the meat that tested negative was allowed to be sold for food, even though its website states a negative test doesn't guarantee the animal is not infected. Still, one researcher who has studied the disease for years says the risk to consumers buying farmed meat is exceptionally low, but says hunters should be careful.
I'm never going to say there's no risk. Again, I think that the bigger risk is to hunters that aren't testing their animals or that are eating test-positive animals.
Quebec's red deer producers say last year's case has had a ripple effect on the industry.
All of us are concerned about that because the venison market is very, very disturbed.
The CFIA says none of the animals from the last 2 cases entered the food system and the farms remain under quarantine. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
Up next on The National, why the squid are rolling back into Conception Bay, Newfoundland.
I don't know anybody know. I don't know anybody know where they go when they leave. There were lots of squid in our bay years ago, and everybody knows the squid went away, and now they're on the way back.
The mysterious phenomenon making waves is next. Squid jigging is an old tradition in Newfoundland. You take a jigger, which I learned today is an unbaited fishing line, drop it in the water, then you jerk it upward in hopes of catching squid by the fins and flipping them into your boat. Conception Bay was long known for its squid fishery, but decades ago they stopped coming. But now the squid are back in a big way, and so that is our moment.
I used to see this regularly in the 1970s. It used to be a routine, and now it's a phenomenon.
They usually roll best in the morning and the evening, but even at midday, there are so many squid you could reach in and catch them with your bare hands. But beware, you do run the risk of getting a squirt.
Is it ink or just water?
Do you really want to know?
Yeah.
Squid jigging is so ingrained in the culture, it spawned a very popular song written in the 1920s.
Oh, this is the place where the fishermen gather.
This was the first commercial recording of a Newfoundland folk song.
Have you ever seen anything like this before?
No, really, not in my lifetime.
No one knows why they're back, but here's another warning. Beware of their beaks. Squid can bite.
Ow!
Today, the CBC's Zach Gowdy found that out firsthand.
It may be small, but it bit me. I'm going to bite you back.
The return of the squid seems to fascinate everyone.
I mean, the song is lovely, Ian, and and you know this about me. So I'm allergic to seafood, and I got to tell you, there is no part of me that feels sorry for myself right now. I don't really feel like I'm missing out on a whole lot.
So I think it's an acquired taste, right? Being there and doing the squid jigging and having the squid, especially, you know, but I mean, a lot of people love it. Yeah. But the song's kind of an acquired taste too. And I want to talk about the song for a moment because where I grew up on the East Coast, not in Newfoundland, but in the Maritimes, I remember that song, like it was a folk song. So I'm going to do something never done before in the National. On the same day that I,
I thought you were
made
gonna sing the
reference
song.
to A$AP Rocky and learned how to pronounce his name, I will make reference to Stompin' Tom Connors. Oh, you're worried I'm going to sing? Not going to sing. He does a version of the song on YouTube. I recommend people give it a taste. See what they think.
Okay.
That is The National for August 14th. Good night.
Good night.